He told his parents he was afraid that if he slept, the thing chasing him would get him, so he tried to stay awake for days at a time. When he finally fell asleep, his parents thought this crisis was over. Then they heard screams in the middle of the night. By the time they got to him, he was dead. He died in the middle of a nightmare. Here was a youngster having a vision of a horror that everyone older was denying. That became the central line of A Nightmare on Elm Street. Wes Craven. A Nightmare on Elm Street is the quintessential 1984 American slasher film, written and directed by Wes Craven and produced by Robert Shea. It is the first installment in the Nightmare on Elm Street film series and stars Heather Langenkamp, John Saxon, Ronnie Blakely, and Robert Englund as Freddy Krueger, also featuring Johnny Depp in his first film debut. The plot concerns 4 teenagers living on one street in the fictitious town of Springwood, Ohio, who are invaded and killed in their dreams, and thus killed in reality by a burned killer with a bladed leather glove. Craven filmed The Nightmare on Elm Street on an estimated budget of $1.8 million. The film was released on November 9th, 1984, and grossed $57 million worldwide. A Nightmare on Elm Street was met with rave critical reviews and is considered to be one of the greatest horror films ever made, spawning a franchise consisting of 6 sequels, a television series, a crossover with Friday the 13th, and various other merchandise. A remake of the same name was released in 2010. The film is credited with using many of the tropes found in the low-budget horror films of the 70s and 80s that originated with John Carpenter's Halloween, and led this subgenre to be called the slasher film. The film includes a morality play where sexually promiscuous teenagers are killed. Critics and film historians state that the film's premise is the struggle to define the distinction between dreams and reality, manifested by the lives and dreams of the teens in the film. Critics today praise the film's ability to transgress the boundaries between the imaginary and real, toying with audience perceptions. The film was followed soon after by A Nightmare on Elm Street 2, Freddy's Revenge. But what gave birth to this icon of horror cinema? There is a very real story behind the creation of Freddy Krueger and A Nightmare on Elm Street. Let's take a look at the real story that influenced Wes Craven's horror classic. The basis of the film was inspired by several newspaper articles printed in the Los Angeles Times in the 1970s about Hmong refugees who, after fleeing to the United States because of war and genocide in Laos, Cambodia and Vietnam, suffered disturbing nightmares and refused to sleep. Dozens of Southeast Asian refugees in America died for unknown reasons in their sleep during the 1980s. The mysterious deaths were usually among young men in their 20s and 30s, and affected a large enough segment of this population to alarm public health experts. In fact, their death rate was 10 times higher than their American counterparts. The newspapers of the day ran such headlines as "Mysterious Fatal Malady Striking Among Men" and "Night Deaths of Asian Men Unexplained." These stories ran throughout the late 1970s and were of course seen by filmmaker Wes Craven. This article ran in the May the 10th, 1981 edition of the New York Times. The Federal Centers for Disease Control in Atlanta is conducting an intensive inquiry into the manner in which 18 apparently healthy Lawan refugees died mysteriously in their sleep in this country within the last 4 years. One possibility being explored is that they were frightened to death by nightmares. The 17 men and 1 woman were members of a Lawan mountain society. About 35,000 are now living in the United States. Most of them fled their homeland after it was overrun. They came from an isolated culture similar to that of the American Indian. Most of those who have been resettled in this country live in concentrated communities. Very few speak English. Their own tongue became a written language only a few years ago, and their adaptation to American life has been marginal. The cause of death in the 18 refugees in their own beds in the early morning hours remains a mystery. Their deaths have generally been attributed to probable cardiac arrhythmia or irregular heartbeat, although pathologists have been reluctant to advance it publicly. One possibility being explored is an obscure pattern described in medical literature as nightmare death syndrome, in which death results from terror induced by a nightmare. Accidental death and natural causes were ruled out, as was suicide. Dr. Michael McGee, assistant medical examiner, said, "There is all kinds of speculation, but for the time being, we have no explanation." He said, "All these people seem to have been in good health. I don't know what they died of. They didn't die of getting shot in the head, stabbed in the heart. They didn't fall off the roof. They didn't get poisoned. Because we did an autopsy in each case and we got a big 0. He noted that many of the deaths had occurred within 18 months. "We didn't think anything mysterious was afoot until the 3rd and 4th deaths happened very quickly," he said. "But then we began to wonder." He thought they might literally have been frightened to death. Nightmare death syndrome is a fatal affliction, Dr. McGee said, and it has been suggested as the cause of death in similar cases among many young males between 30 and 40 years old. Some people speculated that a chemical nerve gas that the refugee soldiers of the Vietnam War would have been exposed to could be responsible. The theory was not supported by doctors, however. Dr. Larry V. Newman, county medical examiner, stated in an LA Times article, "Nerve gas doesn't act this way. There's no evidence. Secondly, if it was nerve gas, why does it affect only males, and why only during the night?" Many refugees themselves believed they were being punished by the spirits of their ancestors for leaving their homeland. This anxiety centered around the inability to do right by your ancestral spirits because you're not there, or because you don't have the right things to perform the right rituals. Doctor said, "I do think that for many of that generation, the traditional explanation remains salient, if not more salient, than explanations related to cardiovascular problems or modern science." The startling possibility is that the medical literature literally describes nightmare death syndrome, suggesting that the apparently healthy young men might literally have been frightened to death. This wave of tragic deaths is still unexplained by science. As late as 1988, medical journals were still discussing this issue, many of which are available to view online. In one article from 1988, a high incidence of sudden unexplained nocturnal deaths has been reported among young Asian males. Careful review of the terminal events surrounding these deaths suggests that the victims suffered from night terrors. Night terrors are a sleep order characterized by vocalization, motor activity, a non-arousable state, and severe autonomic discharge. The proposed recognition of both night terrors and cardiac anomalies in these patients offers a pathopsychological mechanism for their sudden death. Night terror, also known as sleep terror, is a sleep disorder causing feelings of panic or dread, typically occurring during the first hours of stage 3 to 4 non-rapid eye sleep, and lasting for 1 to 10 minutes. They can last longer, especially in children. Sleep terrors usually begin in childhood and usually decrease with age. Night terrors tend to happen during periods of arousal from delta sleep. Delta sleep occurs most often during the first half of a sleep cycle, which indicates that people with more delta sleep activity are more prone to night terrors. However, they can also occur during daytime naps. While nightmares, bad dreams during REM sleep that cause feelings of horror or fear, are relatively common during childhood, night terrors occur less frequently. The prevalence of sleep terrors in general is unknown. The number of children who experience sleep terror episodes are estimated at 36.9%. In adults, the prevalence is only 2.2%. Night terrors have been known since ancient times. Sleep paralysis is a state, during waking or falling asleep, in which a person is aware but unable to move or speak. During an episode, one may hallucinate, hear, feel, or see things that are not there, which often result in deep fear. Episodes generally last less than a couple of minutes. It may occur as a single episode or be recurrent. The condition may occur in those who are otherwise healthy. It may run in families as a result of specific genetic changes. Treatment options for sleep paralysis have been poorly studied. It is recommended that people be reassured that the condition is common and generally not serious. Between 8 and 50% of people experience sleep paralysis at some point in their lives. 5% of people have regular episodes. Males and females are affected equally. Sleep paralysis has been described throughout history. It has believed to have played a role in the creation of stories about alien abduction and other paranormal events. Many believe that there is an intruder in the room, or the presence of an incubus, or the sensation of floating. The intruder and incubus hallucinations highly correlate with one another. Some other diagnoses for this condition include exploding head syndrome. It's a potentially frightening parasomnia in which sounds sound particularly loud and jarring, but there is no paralysis. Nightmare disorder, nocturnal panic attacks, and post-traumatic stress disorder, which often includes scary imagery and anxiety, but is not limited to sleep-wake transitions. In folklore, the Knight Hag is a generic name for a folkloric creature found in cultures around the world, and which is used to explain the phenomenon of sleep paralysis. A common description is that a person feels a presence of a supernatural, malevolent being, which immobilizes the person as if sitting on the chest. This phenomenon goes by many names around the world. Many people describe shadow people, a humanoid figure interpreted as the presence of a spirit or other entity by believers in the paranormal or supernatural. A number of religions, legends, and belief systems describe these shadow people as shades of the underworld, shadowy creatures that have long been a staple of folklore and ghost stories. But can these terrors, superstitions, and perceptions really cause you to die in your sleep? Live Science studied this matter in 2010, concluding that in sleep, the heart can be normal for quite some time, and then it may stop unexpectedly. Usually, the heart stops at night, and in Southeast Asia, it once caused more deaths among young males than car accidents. These deaths occur at night because the heart beats more weakly when people sleep. When the heart slows down for sleep, the electrical problems become more pronounced. They overtake the body's ability to regulate its own heartbeat and can send the heart into a deadly spasm. In a startling report published in 1983 by Raven Press, New York, entitled "Mortality Risk Associated with Sleeping Patterns Among Adults," they concluded, men 30 years or older who slept under 4 hours per night were 2.8 times more likely to die as those who slept 7 or 8, whereas those who slept over 10 hours were 1.8 times as likely to die. Comparable ratios for women were 1.5 and 1.8. The clear advice here is to sleep 7 or 8 hours a night. However, statistically, these cases are very rare, approximately 20 in every million per population. That's 0.002%. And in many cases, there's an extremely rare underlying health condition. It's often recognized by both horror fans and critics alike that the best that the horror genre has to offer has some grounding in social commentary or reality. The genius of Wes Craven was recognizing these strange occurrences that we've discussed today and using them to create a true cultural icon of horror cinema in Freddy Krueger and The Nightmare on Elm Street. Thank you for watching, don't have nightmares, and take it easy.